So today Apple announced the release of the new Mac M1 MacBook Pros, which feature the new M1 Pro and M1 Max chips in both 14 and 16-inch versions, with a host of new in-body features and CPU upgrades from their existing M1 lineup. There's multiple configurations and options at different price points, and I wanted to talk about the new features, how they compare to the old M1 MacBooks, and the rather significant cost, and my perspective about which one might be worth getting from a filmmaker and editor's perspective. I've done some very in-depth tests on the Mac M1 and how well it runs different editing software, how it compares to my iMac 2020 in terms of editing performance, and how Final Cut, Premiere and DaVinci Resolve perform against each other when editing different types of footage. So I encourage you to go back and check those out. But it's safe to say I'm deep in the Apple ecosystem and I've used the old M1 extensively. So like everyone, I've been very excited for this announcement. Also, this is not a minor upgrade or update. All of the changes that have been introduced to these new MacBooks are huge. So let's talk about them. So first, let's look at the new additions to the body of the Mac M1 models that I'm most excited about. The new models come in both 14-inch and 16-inch sizes. Both versions come with identical ports, so you get 3 Thunderbolt ports compared to only 2 on the 13-inch M1, and an SDXC memory card slot, and an HDMI port, and a MagSafe power adapter socket. This is the same across all of the new models, and it's excellent because it solves one of the biggest issues I had with the 13-inch M1, the lack of ports. On the 13-inch model, you would use one of your Thunderbolt ports to plug in your laptop, you'd use the other maybe to run an external monitor, and suddenly you had no ports for things like hard drives, memory cards. Basically, it was this huge limitation. On the new M1s, all your Thunderbolt ports can potentially remain free for accessories such as hard drives, because you can use the HDMI port for your external monitor and the MagSafe port powers the MacBook. And of course you can now pop your SDXC memory cards into the inbuilt card reader, which for people creating video content or taking photos is an excellent feature to reintroduce. The screen itself features an even better Liquid Retina XDR display. The speaker's audio quality has been improved, as has the inbuilt webcam, which has doubled in resolution. But to be honest, I was more excited about the ports, because most of the time I'm running my laptop with an external monitor and external hard drives, and the display was already good. But now we're talking about one of the best quality displays on the market, and certainly probably the best laptop/notebook display. So overall, in terms of the body upgrades, this is all awesome. Practical features that will be perfect for video editors. Another thing to note is the limitation of running more than one external monitor on the original MacBook M1 is gone. So you can finally run 2 high-resolution displays without a workaround, which again, if you're like me, is very important for my editing workflow. Now we come to the big curveball, which is that Apple introduced not 1, but 2 new M1 chips. The M1 Pro and its big brother, the M1 Max. So we're definitely getting a more iPhone/iPad centric style feel to these tiered structure of upgrades. Everyone knew there was going to be a new, faster M1 chip, and what we didn't know is that there were going to be 2, and that they were both going to be available at launch. There are also multiple versions of the M1 Pro and M1 Max chips available to configure with your MacBook, with each version potentially adding CPU and GPU cores to improve performance. The 14-inch MacBook with the M1 Pro 8-core CPU and a 14-core GPU chip is the base model and the cheapest new version of the M1 Pro you can buy. But Apple did not go into detail about how much better that would be in comparison to the original M1, and I suspect the improvements will be a lot less dramatic, as these are binned M1 chips. So again, from a filmmaker/editor's perspective who already owns the original M1, I'm looking for significant across-the-board improvements in performance. So I'll be looking at the 10-core CPU and 16-core GPU version as my starting point for purchasing. This is $300 more expensive than the lowest spec base model. According to Apple, this version's CPU is allegedly up to 70% faster than the original M1, and it has a 16-core GPU, which is double that of the original M1. So perhaps unsurprisingly, it can deliver up to double the GPU performance. This new M1 Pro chip can also now support up to 32 gigs of unified memory, while the original M1 chip could only support 16 gigs. This is again solving a big limitation of the old 13-inch MacBook M1, which definitely began to slow down when editing projects that got past a certain size and level of complexity. Another huge addition, which hasn't received as much coverage, is the addition of a ProRes encode and decode engine. And what that means is that if you work with ProRes content, say like me, you film in ProRes on a Blackmagic camera like I'm doing now, or you shoot ProRes RAW, the M1 Pro is going to absolutely blaze through rendering your footage. You know, this is going to be really helpful, and allegedly may even work more effectively than the current Mac Pro's ProRes Afterburner card. The M1 already handles ProRes exceptionally well, but the promise of being able to run multiple streams of 4K and 8K ProRes on a new M1 Pro machine is very appealing to me, and will be for any filmmaker who utilizes this particular format. So the 14-inch MacBook M1 Pro with the 10-core CPU and 16-core GPU is my starting point. And if we upgrade the memory from 16 gig to 32 gig, the cost is a hefty, but not astronomical, $2,699. If we're agreeing hypothetically with Apple's claims that the computer will essentially provide twice the performance of the original M1, that's definitely a pretty interesting value proposition for the jump in specs and usability. I think if you're working on a limited budget, this is probably the best option for a very noticeable upgrade without completely breaking the bank. But then we also have the M1 Max chip, which adds either a binned 24-core GPU or a full 32-core GPU, while the 10-core CPU remains the same as the M1 Pro chip. Basically, this means graphics-heavy processors, which are vital for video editing, render performance, exporting, timeline playback, are all going to see another jump up in performance over even the M1 Pro when using the M1 Max chip. But if you're doing regular CPU-heavy tasks, then maybe you're not going to notice much of an improvement in upgrading to the M1 Max chip from the M1 Pro. Apart from the additional GPU cores, the M1 Max also has an additional twin video encoding engine and two ProRes encode-decode engines. What this probably means in real-world performance is that the M1 Max's ability to play footage smoothly for a variety of codecs and its ability to export faster will be significantly better than the M1 Pro, theoretically twice as fast. As an editor, this really piqued my interest because you cannot put a price on good fast render times. Well, in this case you can, it's an extra $200. Apple have stated that the 32-core M1 Max chip is up to 4 times faster than the original M1 chip in terms of GPU performance. And if you've seen my review of the original M1, I noted the lack of GPU power really compromised the Mac M1 for heavy, intense editing work. When you start denoising footage, adding stabilization, doing heavy color grades, and really stacking your timeline or trying to export very high resolution footage, the M1 is just not quite good enough. This M1 Max version should be exactly what editors and filmmakers such as myself were hoping for the first time round, and it should deliver a professional level solution for potentially all of your editing needs. Now, another interesting thing about the M1 Max chip is that you can put the best version of the chip in either the 14-inch or 16-inch MacBook body. Traditionally, as you've gone larger with your MacBooks, you've also gotten better performance. But because these M1 chips are still very small, they can fit in either body. So essentially, you can have the fastest version of the M1 in the smaller 14-inch body if you want. And this is something to consider if you mainly use your MacBook with an external monitor. and you want to save a bit of money. Or you like having the smaller form factor for your mobile workstation. The other thing to note is that when getting the best M1 Max chip, you are automatically bumped up to 32 gigs of unified memory. There is no 16 gig option. Also, the M1 Max chip provides an additional 64 gig memory option that is not available with the regular M1 Pro. So if we look at the original M1, it seemed, at least to me, that the memory was utilized much more efficiently, meaning that 16 gigs of memory felt more like 32 gigs in a traditional Intel-based Mac. Now, I admit I'm just speculating, but 32 gig for editing, given the M1's proven efficiency at utilizing memory, means this option should be enough for most use cases. But that 64 gig option will assist you in conjunction with the GPU for all those virtual memory tasks. All that being said, if you buy a 14-inch MacBook Pro with a 32-core M1 Max chip and 32 gig of memory, it will cost you $3,100 with the 512 gig hard drive. If you bump up to the 16-inch MacBook with the same specs, it will cost you $200 more at $3,300. Is it worth paying $200 extra for that extra 2 inches of screen real estate? For home editing, personally, I would suggest no. For remote editing, I would suggest yes. It is also possible the additional size of the 16-inch model will provide better thermal cooling and therefore better sustained performance, but that is yet to be proven. If I was looking at one of these versions, I would prefer to upgrade the 64 gig of memory at the cost of $400 rather than having a bigger screen, which would cost $200. This takes a 14-inch MacBook Pro with the best M1 Max chip and the most memory, a 512 gig hard drive, to $3,500 for what is essentially a dream editing laptop. Compare that to the original top spec M1 laptop, which is going to cost you $1,700. Now, if you do the basic math on this, if that M1 Max MacBook is roughly 4 times faster than the original M1, and you're only paying just over twice as much, while it does seem expensive, that's actually, from a performance standpoint, very good value for money. It doesn't, however, diminish the fact that you are having to pay twice as much. I feel like one of the best things about the M1, the original, is its cost to performance ratio. We always knew that these upgraded versions would cost more, but just over double? To me, this no longer puts it in quite the same awesome deal category as the original M1, especially because a lot of the time you're probably not going to notice that alleged 4 times improvement in your day-to-day editing. So I do think these new models have become a little cost prohibitive. I think what we're seeing is Apple acknowledging just how good these chips are and expecting you to pay Apple prices for them, whereas the original M1 was a lot more about testing the consumer uptick and interest and pricing them much more competitively to encourage users to take the leap to an unproven technology that had not yet been adopted industry-wide. Now that we see just how good the M1s are, they've appled us. But let's play devil's advocate here and look at the most powerful current 27-inch Intel iMac, which I own and use for most of my editing work. I've upgraded to 64 gigs of third-party RAM, which I bought on Amazon for $400, which is $600 less than it would have cost me to purchase through Apple. I have upgraded my graphics card to the 5700 XT 16 gig Radeon Pro graphics card, and I have upgraded the Ethernet port to 10 gigs. Including my RAM, that comes to a total of $3,200, which is $200 less than a fully spec'd out M1 Max would cost me. If I'd brought my extra RAM through Apple, I'd be paying $3,800 for this iMac. Of course, I also get a 5K Retina Pro display and some additional USB and Ethernet ports with this Mac, but in terms of price difference, there's actually very little in it. Now, if we look at some of the render time comparisons between my original M1 and my iMac, you can see that the iMac handily beats it, but it is certainly not 4 times faster in most scenarios, and it's not even 2 times faster in many tests. So if the new M1 Max can deliver that much of a boost in editing performance, it means that these new M1s, particularly the M1 Max versions, will be the first M1s to officially beat their current iMac spec'd out desktop equivalents. For an editor like myself, that's pretty damn exciting to me. If you're someone like me with an Intel iMac and the original M1, you could potentially sell those both and replace them with an M1 Max, and you would keep your portable workstation, end up with a faster, more powerful editing machine that potentially does a better job than either of them, and have a lot of extra money left over. I don't know about you, but that's a very interesting proposition and one that doesn't have much of a downside. And we haven't even talked about power consumption and the potential savings you can make working with one of these machines. But first, let's acknowledge we haven't seen any real-world testing of these machines, so we are speculating in terms of editing performance. If we go by Apple's statements and assume that what they have claimed performance-wise is correct, we're looking at some excellent editing machines with big upsides. As someone who does a lot of big edit jobs and found the original M1 to be close but no cigar in terms of a machine for my work, I think these new versions address all of my issues. And for professional editors, I think that the M1 Max versions are going to be the sweet spot in terms of price to performance and accommodating your more demanding workflow requirements. Meanwhile, for anyone who is more of a casual editor or just can't afford the upper tier version, the M1 Pros will be more than enough for most video work. We've got additional ports we desperately needed, double the performance. I mean, what more do you really need? So I think there are two important questions left for those contemplating one of these machines as an editor filmmaker who, like me, is going to go for an M1 Max. And that is, just how much of a notable editing performance increase do you get between the 24-core M1 Max and its 32-core counterpart? Is this an area where you can potentially save money? And the same goes for the questions of 32 gigs of unified memory versus 64 gigs. Will 32 gig be enough given the M1 chip's efficiency? I would think so. Saving on those two upgrades brings the cost of a 14-inch machine down from $3,500 to $2,900, a savings of a substantial $600, which sounds very appealing. The only way to make an informed decision on these final choices is to wait for people like Max Tech to do their rigorous comparison testing videos, but I'm not sure if I have the patience to wait. If you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like and subscribing. I make feature films, web series and shorts, and I'm here to give tips and advice to indie filmmakers about how to make those things. If you're diving in on the new Mac M1s, let me know in the comment section and which version you decided to pick up, or why you've decided to wait. As always, I am the Savage Filmmaker, and I'll see you when I see you.